They came without warning. A white van rolling slow down my dirt road. 4 men in bright yellow vests stepped out. Not a word, not a knock. Just boots crushing the gravel of my driveway. They looked like they owned the place. They said they had authority. But on my land, their rules meant nothing. That was the moment I picked up my rifle. And that was the moment everything changed. Welcome back to HOA Stories, where the small battles of suburbia turn into wars you'll never forget. My name is Daniel. I live in a quiet town on the edge of Texas. I work long hours at the mill, and I take care of this little patch of land my father left me. The HOA doesn't like men like me, men who don't bow, men who don't bend. And on that hot afternoon, they sent surveyors onto my yard. What they didn't know was that I was ready for them. They said they had authority, but on my land, their rules meant nothing. That afternoon, the sun was heavy in the sky, the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer. My yard was quiet, just the hum of cicadas and the creak of the old windmill behind the barn. Then came the sound of tires on gravel, slow, steady, deliberate. I looked up from the porch and saw the white van rolling in, dust clouds rising behind it like smoke from a fire. The van stopped right at the edge of my drive. The doors opened, and out they came. 4 men in bright yellow vests, hard hats tucked under their arms, clipboards in hand. They didn't wave, didn't ask, didn't say a word. They just marched forward like soldiers on some mission. I called out, but they didn't even turn their heads. Boots on gravel, boots on my land. And all I could think was how many times this HOA had tried to break me. You see, life in this neighborhood isn't what outsiders think. The houses are neat, the grass is trimmed, the mailboxes are lined up like soldiers fro. On the outside, it looks peaceful, but inside, it's war. Every week a new letter. Your fence is 2 inches too high. Your grass is 1 shade too brown. Your trash can is 3 minutes too late on collection day. Petty rules, stacked on petty rules, and the worst part, they never ask. They command. I had tried to ignore it, tried to keep my head down. But this time was different. This wasn't a letter. This wasn't a fine. This was strangers, on my land, walking past my fence like it wasn't even there. I walked down the steps, slow at first, my boots hitting the wood hard enough to make the boards creak. One of the men finally looked up. He had a trimmed beard and sharp eyes, the kind of eyes that say, "I'm in charge," even when he's not. He smirked, like I was nothing more than a bump in his schedule. "We have authority," he said. Authority. The word echoed in my head like a gunshot. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. Authority? On my land? This was my father's land, my family's land, and no clipboard or yellow vest could change that. I felt the old anger rising, the kind of anger that doesn't come fast, but builds slow, steady, until it's too heavy to hold down. I thought of the years of letters, the threats of fines, the whispers from neighbors too scared to speak up, and now these men, trespassing under the banner of authority. I walked to the barn and leaned against the door. Inside hung the old rifle, the same one my father kept by his bed. Not for hunting deer, but for protecting what was his. I didn't take it down yet. I just looked at it, and I thought, maybe this was the day it needed to see the light again. The men kept walking, measuring with their eyes, marking spots with little orange flags, like my yard was a battlefield, and they were drawing their map. One of them looked back at the van and shouted something I couldn't hear. The others laughed. While standing on my land, it felt like a slap across the face. I stepped forward, the dirt crunching under my boots. "Who sent you?" I asked. They didn't answer. They just kept moving, as if I was invisible, as if my voice didn't matter. That's when I realized something. To them, I wasn't a homeowner. I wasn't a man. I was just another square on their map, another obstacle in their project, and that I could not allow. The sun beat hotter. The air grew thicker. I could feel my heart thumping in my chest like a drum. The rifle in the barn seemed to call to me, not as a weapon, but as a reminder that no man is truly powerless when he protects what is his. I stood there, staring at the surveyors, and they stared right back. Until finally the one with the beard smiled again. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who thinks he has already won. The smile on his face burned into me. That smug little curve of his lips, like he had already won. Before the fight had even started, I stepped closer, close enough to smell the dust on their boots, close enough to see the sweat dripping down their foreheads, but not one of them moved aside. They stood their ground, in my yard, like they belonged here. The man with the beard tapped his clipboard. "You can't stop us," he said. "We have orders, signed and sealed." Orders. The word stung like vinegar in a fresh wound, because I never signed anything. I never agreed to strangers walking onto my land without asking. But the HOA, they didn't need permission. At least, that's what they believed. One of the others started planting a flag into the soil, bright orange, sticking out like a wound on the earth. I felt something tighten in my chest. That flag wasn't just plastic and wood, it was a challenge, a marker that said, "This belongs to us now." I clenched my fists, and for a second, I thought of letting it go, just letting them walk their path, letting them measure and mark and laugh. But deep down, I knew what would happen next. Today it was a flag. Tomorrow it would be a fence, then a wall, and soon, my land would no longer be mine. I couldn't let that happen. The old barn door creaked as I pulled it open. The rifle hung on the wall, heavy with history. I took it down slow, not raising it, not aiming it, just holding it in my hands like my father once did. The weight of it made me feel grounded, made me feel alive. The men noticed. Their voices dropped. Their laughter died in their throats. The orange flag wobbled in the man's hand as he froze mid-motion. "Whoa now," one of them muttered. His voice cracked like a boy caught stealing cookies. "Put that down." But I didn't, because I wasn't threatening. I was warning. There's a difference. And they knew it. The man with the beard took a step back, but his pride kept him from retreating all the way. "You're making a mistake," he said. His eyes darted to the others, but they didn't move. Not one of them had the courage to step closer. I rested the rifle against my shoulder, not pointed, not ready, just there, a presence they couldn't ignore. And suddenly, the power shifted. They weren't the ones in control anymore. Their clipboards, their flags, their so-called authority. All of it crumbled under the weight of a single truth. This was my land, and they were trespassers. For a long moment, the world went silent. No cicadas, no birds, just the sound of their nervous breaths in the hot Texas air. Finally, one of them spoke. "Look, we're just doing our job." His voice trembled like a boy caught lying. "We don't want trouble." Trouble? I almost laughed, because trouble had already come the moment their boots crossed my fence line. The man with the beard glared at me, but the fire in his eyes was fading. He knew this wasn't a battle he could win with words, not today. He gave a sharp whistle. The others hesitated, then slowly began stepping back, their boots crunching against gravel, their eyes locked on the rifle in my hands, step by step. They moved toward the van. Not running, not turning their backs, just retreating like men who had seen a ghost they didn't want to face again. The orange flag stayed stuck in the dirt, and when the last man climbed into the van, I walked over and ripped it out of the ground, snapping it clean in two. The plastic cracked like brittle bone in my hands. The van engine roared, dust filled the air, and just like that, they were gone. I stood there alone in the silence, the rifle still heavy in my grip, the broken flag lying at my feet, and for the first time in years, I felt free. But freedom always comes with a price. And as I stared at that dirt road, I knew the HOA would not let this slide. They would come back. They always do. The dust from their van still hung in the air. A cloud of grit rolling across my yard like a ghost refusing to leave. I stood there, rifle in hand. The broken orange flag lying at my boots, and though the van was gone, the fight was not over. No. It was only beginning. I leaned against the porch rail and let out a long breath. For a moment, I almost felt proud, like I had drawn a line in the dirt and dared them to cross it. And they hadn't. But deep inside, another feeling twisted in my gut, because I knew men like that didn't just give up. No. They regroup. They complain to their masters. They come back stronger, sharper, more dangerous. The HOA was like a nest of wasps. Hit one, and the swarm would follow. I went inside. The house was cool and dim, the hum of the old fridge the only sound. I set the rifle down on the kitchen table and for the first time in years, I poured myself a drink. The glass shook in my hand as I sipped, not from fear, but from the weight of what had just happened. Because I knew I hadn't just scared off a few surveyors, I had declared war. And in this neighborhood, war doesn't come with guns and soldiers. It comes with paper, letters, threats, written, and in black ink on white envelopes. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside felt louder. Every crunch of gravel on the road made me think the van was back. I sat by the window with the rifle propped against the wall, waiting, watching, listening. The morning came, and with it, the letter. It was shoved through the slot in my door like poison slipped into a drink. The envelope was stamped with the HOA's seal, bold, arrogant, unforgiving. I tore it open with shaking hands, and the words hit me like a hammer. Hostile behavior, threatening conduct, violation of community safety standards. They called me a danger to the neighborhood, a threat to peace. They demanded a fine so heavy it nearly knocked the air from my chest. And worse, they warned that legal action would follow if I resisted again. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was madness. They trespassed. They walked onto my land without permission. And now, I was the criminal? I crumpled the paper in my fist and tossed it into the trash. But the anger didn't leave me. It sat in my chest, heavy as stone. And I knew this was only the first strike. By noon, the neighbors had already heard. I stepped outside and saw curtains twitching, eyes peering from behind blinds. Whispers carried across the street like smoke. Some looked at me with fear, others with curiosity, but none with friendship. Not one. That's the poison of an HOA. They don't just fine you, they turn the whole block against you. They make you the villain in your own story. By evening, the next move came. 3 cars pulled up by the curb, not surveyors this time, board members. I knew their faces. I'd seen them at every meeting. The president, Mrs. Caldwell. Her smile stretched thin, like rubber pulled too far, her eyes sharp as glass. She was the kind of woman who could ruin you with a single signature. She stepped out in our pressed suit, heels sinking into my gravel drive. Behind her were 2 men, both stiff, both carrying folders under their arms. They walked like lawyers. They spoke like vultures. I stayed on the porch, arms crossed, waiting. "Mr. Daniels," Mrs. Caldwell said, her voice sweet, too sweet. "We need to talk about yesterday." I didn't answer. I just stared. Let her words hang heavy in the hot air. "You threatened our contractors," she continued. "You interfered with a legal survey. This is serious, very serious." Her eyes flicked to the rifle leaning by my chair. Not in my hands, not raised. Just there, present, silent. "You understand," she said, "that brandishing a weapon is grounds for police involvement." I leaned forward. "Brandishing?" I said softly. "No, ma'am. I was protecting my land." Her smile twitched, but didn't break. "You think this is your land. But community property lines belong to the association. And yesterday, you crossed a line." Her words cut, because they weren't just about borders, they were about control. One of the men behind her cleared his throat. He pulled out a paper from his folder. It was an official notice, stamped, signed, and smug as hell. "Effective immediately," he read. "Mr. Daniels is fined $15,000 for hostile conduct. And pending review, his right to vote in community decisions is revoked." Revoked, as if I had ever voted in their games, as if my voice had ever mattered. Mrs. Caldwell tilted her head, her smile widened, sharp as a blade. "You can appeal," she said, "but we both know how those hearings go." I stood, slow, deliberate, and for a moment, I thought of the rifle at my side. But no, this wasn't the time. Instead, I looked her dead in the eye. "This isn't over," I said. Her smile finally faded, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of fear. She turned, heels snapping against the gravel. The men followed, their papers tucked away like stolen treasure. The cars drove off. The street grew silent again, but in that silence, I felt the storm brewing, because if they thought it, I would bow. If they thought they could fine me into silence, they didn't know me at all. I walked back inside, sat at the table, and began to plan, because this wasn't just about money. This was about pride, about freedom, about drawing a line so deep in the dirt that even the HOA couldn't cross it. The house was quiet that night, too quiet, but my mind was loud. I kept replaying her smile, that thin line of power on Mrs. Caldwell's face, like she believed the papers she waved could cage me, like ink and signatures meant more than dirt and sweat and blood. I sat at the kitchen table with the rifle leaning against the chair beside me, not as a weapon, but as a reminder that power only matters if you let someone take it from you. The crumpled letter still lay in the trash, the fine, the threats, the revocation of rights, $15,000 for standing my ground, $15,000 for refusing to bow. I didn't sleep that night. I watched the road through the window. I listened to the hum of the fridge, the groan of the old pipes, and I waited for what I knew was coming. Morning came slow. The sun crept over the roofs, turning the neat lawns gold. The street was alive again. Children rode bikes. Sprinklers hissed. Dogs barked from behind fences. But the eyes of the neighbors told a different story. Every curtain twitched when I stepped outside. Every conversation paused when I walked past. The man across the street, Mr. Johnson, nodded at me once, but it wasn't friendly, it was nervous. Like he didn't want to be seen talking to me. That's how the HOA works. They don't just punish you, they isolate you. They poison the well so every neighbor sees you as the problem. By noon, the first note appeared. It was tucked under my doormat, folded in half, scrawled in black ink. You're making it worse for all of us. Stop fighting, just pay and move on. No name, no signature. Just fear. Fear delivered like mail. I tore it up and tossed it. But the next day, another came. This one slipped into my mailbox without a stamp. You're dangerous. We don't want people like you here. Leave before you get someone hurt. I read the words twice, not because I needed to, but because I couldn't believe them. Dangerous? Me? I had lived here longer than half these people. I fixed my own fences, mowed my own grass, helped the old man down the road when his car broke down. Dangerous was not who I was, but it was the story they wanted to tell. By the third day, I found 3 notes, one taped to my garage door, one shoved under the windshield of my truck, and one slipped through the slot again, each sharper than the last, each dripping with anger that didn't belong to my neighbors. But to the HOA's poison, I knew Caldwell was behind it. She had her claws in this place so deep that people were afraid to breathe without her permission. She was turning the neighborhood into her own little kingdom, and I was the enemy at the gate. The tension grew heavier with every sunrise. Cars slowed when they passed my house. Parents pulled their kids closer when I walked by. Even the mailman started leaving my letters at the very edge of the box, as if touching my property might burn him. And then came the police. It was a Saturday afternoon. I was fixing the fence line when the cruiser rolled up, lights flashing. But no siren. 2 officers stepped out, hands resting on their belts, not hostile, but cautious. "Mr. Daniels?" one of them asked. I wiped the sweat from my brow and nodded. "We've had reports," he said. "Claims of threats. Claims you brandished a firearm at workers." The words stung, not because they were true, but because they weren't. "I didn't threaten anyone," I said. "They trespassed on my land. I carried my rifle, yes, but I never raised it, never fired it." The younger officer exchanged a glance with the older one. They'd heard stories, but they didn't have proof. "We're not here to arrest you," the older one said. "Just a warning. Keep it civil. If this escalates, it won't end well for anyone." And just like that, they were gone. But the message was clear. The HOA had called in reinforcements, and next time, it might not end with just a warning. I stood there in the yard, fence half fixed, sweat running down my back, and for the first time, I wondered if they could actually win. Not with guns, not with fists, but with lies, with paper, with fear. That night, another note waited at my door. But this one was different. It wasn't from a neighbor. The handwriting was clean, the paper thick, the seal of the HOA pressed into the corner. I unfolded it slowly, and the words chilled me to the bone. Final warning. Failure to comply will result in legal seizure of property. Board vote scheduled. Consider this your last chance. Seizure. The word burned like fire across the page. They weren't just threatening me with fines anymore. They wanted everything. My land, my house, my father's memory. I crushed the paper in my hands, my jaw clenched, and I swore to myself that I would not give in. Not now, not ever. But still, doubt whispered in the dark corners of my mind. Because I wasn't just fighting one person. I was fighting a machine built on fear and greed and rules written to break men like me. The next morning, my truck tires were slashed, 4 perfect cuts, 4 flat wheels, 4 reminders that the war had moved to a new level. I looked up and saw shadows in the windows, faces vanishing behind curtains. No one stepped forward. No one said a word. Cowards, every one of them, living under Caldwell's thumb, too afraid to fight, too afraid to even stand beside me. But I wasn't afraid. I couldn't be, because fear is how they win. And I wasn't about to hand them the victory, so I patched the fence, I fixed the windows, I cleaned the slashed rubber from the driveway, and I waited, because I knew they would come again. They always do, and when they did, I would be ready. The sound of silence had changed. It was no longer the peace of a quiet street. It was the silence of judgment, of eyes behind curtains, of whispers that carried without voices. Every step I took across my yard felt heavy. Every creak of the porch reminded me I was being watched. Not by strangers, but by neighbors, people I once waved to, people I once trusted. Now, I was the villain in their story, the slashed tires, the notes, the warnings. It was all meant to break me, to corner me into giving up, but I didn't bend. I patched the damage, I cleaned the mess, and I waited for the next strike. It came sooner than I thought. 1 week later, an envelope thicker than the rest landed in my mailbox. The seal of the HOA pressed hard into the corner, the kind of seal meant to scare you before you even read the words. I tore it open at the kitchen table. The pages were heavy, filled with bold black letters that screamed off the page. Mandatory board hearing. Failure to appear will result in legal action. My stomach tightened. This wasn't just another fine. This wasn't just another warning. This was their move to drag me into their arena. The boardroom. Their court. Their stage. The notice gave me 7 days. 7 days to prepare. 7 days to decide if I would walk into the lion's den or let them come to me. I could almost hear my father's voice in my head. Son, men like them don't stop until you make them stop. That night, I barely slept. The house felt smaller than ever, the walls closing in, the ticking of the old clock on the mantel echoing louder than a gunshot. I sat at the table with the rifle across my lap, not raised, not aimed, just there. The weight of it steadied me, but it also reminded me of the fine line I walked. One wrong move, and I'd be the criminal they already painted me to be, day after day. I prepared. I read every rule book the HOA had ever sent me. Page after page of nonsense about mailbox heights, lawn colors, fence stains, rules written to confuse, to trap, to punish. And there it was, buried deep in the fine print, a clause they never thought I'd find. The HOA may not enter or alter private land without prior written consent of the owner. I read it 3 times, then a 4th. The words didn't lie. They had trespassed, and I had proof. 7 days passed like 7 storms, and on the morning of the hearing, I dressed simple, jeans, boots, a plain shirt, no suit, no tie. I wasn't there to play their game. I was there to end it. The boardroom was inside the community center, a cold building with beige walls and the smell of stale coffee. Rows of plastic chairs lined the back, and nearly every one of them was full. Neighbors had come to watch, not to support, but to see me fall. At the front sat the board, Mrs. Caldwell in the center, her smile sharp as ever, the men at her sides flipping through folders thick with papers. They looked up as I entered, not with surprise, but with hunger. "Mr. Daniels," Caldwell said, her voice carrying across the room, "thank you for joining us. This hearing is now in session." I sat in the lone chair facing them, my hands rested on the table. Steady as stone, I didn't speak. Not yet. The first man began reading a list of my so-called crimes. Hostile behavior toward contractors, threatening presence of a firearm, destruction of HOA property. The words hit the room like nails being hammered into a coffin. Gasps rose from the audience. Whispers spread like fire. But I didn't flinch. I let them finish. I let them build their case. When they were done, Caldwell leaned forward, her hands folded neatly, her smile wider than before. "You see, Mr. Daniels," she said, "you've made this community unsafe. You've broken trust. You've acted outside the rules. We cannot allow this behavior to continue." Her words flow ice. Ted through the air, cold, calculated, final. And then I spoke. "I didn't threaten anyone," I said. "My land was trespassed without consent. Your contractors had no right to step 1 foot onto my yard." Caldwell tilted her head, amused. "Consent was not required," she said. "The board voted to survey property lines." I pulled the paper from my pocket, the rulebook page, highlighted, underlined, undeniable. Her smile faltered as I read aloud. "The HOA may not enter or alter private land without prior written consent of the owner." The room shifted. Whispers rose again. This time different. Curious. Uneasy. Caldwell's eyes narrowed. "That's outdated language," she snapped. "Superseded by recent amendments." "Show me," I said. "Show me the amendment that removed this line." Her lips pressed tight, her hands fidgeted with the papers in front of her, but she didn't speak, because she couldn't. The silence stretched across the room. Neighbors leaned forward, eyes wide, for the first time. They weren't seeing me as the villain. They were seeing her as the liar. I leaned back in my chair. "My father built that land with his hands," I said, "and I'll be damned if I let a board of paper pushers steal it with lies." The second man tried to interrupt, muttering about fines and safety, but the words fell flat. The air in the room had shifted. The power was no longer theirs. I stood slowly, the chair scraping against the tile. Every eye followed me as I walked to the door. I didn't look back. I didn't need to, because the truth had already been spoken, and once spoken, it cannot be buried. Outside, the air was fresh, the sun brighter than it had been in weeks. For the first time, I felt the weight lift. If only a little. But deep down, I knew Caldwell wouldn't let this end here. She had been embarrassed, exposed, and people like her don't forgive that. They strike harder, they strike meaner. I lit a cigarette on the steps and looked out at the street. Neighbors filed out behind me. Some glanced my way, some avoided my eyes, but one old man stopped. He nodded once, not with fear, not with pity, but with respect. And for the first time in this war, I wasn't completely alone. Still, I knew the fight was far from over. This was only a battle. The war would come knocking again. The question was, how far was I willing to go? The boardroom battle ended, but the war did not. Mrs. Caldwell's smile may have cracked that day, but her hunger for control did not fade. No, it grew sharper, a snake that had been stepped on, and snakes don't die easy. I returned home that night to find a fresh envelope taped to my front door, not folded, not slipped quietly into the mailbox, taped bold, meant to be seen by anyone walking by. "Pending legal action," the header screamed. Inside, the words painted me as a monster, unstable, hostile, a danger to the safety of the community. They weren't just coming for my wallet anymore. They were coming for my name, my reputation, my very place in this neighborhood. I sat at the table with the letter spread before me. The rifle leaned against the wall as always. And for the first time, I felt the chill of something colder than fines or flags. Exile. That's what Caldwell wanted. Not just to punish me, but to drive me out, to erase me like a stain on her perfect little suburb. The next days blurred together, whispers louder than ever. Children told not to play near my yard. Dogs pulled tight on leashes when they passed my drive. Neighbors who once asked me for help with their fences or their cars now crossed the street without a word. The poison was working. On the third night, I found my trash cans tipped over, garbage scattered across the lawn, eggshells cracked against the porch, and a single note pinned to the door with a nail. "Get out." The words carved into the paper like a scar, the nail hammered deep enough to split the wood. This wasn't fear anymore. This was hate. I pulled the note free and crumpled it in my fist. The nail I left where it was, a reminder of how far this had gone. The old man's words stayed with me, Long after he left my porch that night, he spoke with a quiet voice, but every sentence cut deeper than a knife. The board had done this before. Families pushed out, homes seized, stories buried beneath rules and signatures, and the neighborhood pretended not to notice. But now, the silence was broken. Now, I had proof, and I had a witness. I gathered every paper I had, spread them across the table until the wood was hidden beneath stacks of fines and threats. Every note, every warning, every false claim. The old man sat across from me, his weathered hands flipping through pages, his eyes sharp despite the years. "This is it," he said. "They've gone too far, and we'll show them." We spent hours digging through bylaws, finding the cracks they thought no one would notice, contradictions, rules that clashed with state law, votes they had recorded without proper notice, piece by piece. The board's power looked less like law, and more like fraud, by morning. I had a plan. The next hearing was already scheduled. They wanted to strip me of everything, my land, my home, my voice. But I wasn't walking in there alone this time. I reached out to neighbors, the ones who whispered but never spoke, the single mother down the street who got fined for a pink tricycle left on her porch, the retired veteran who nearly lost his house over a cracked driveway, the family who was told to repaint their fence 3 times in 1 year, one by one. They listened, one by one. They joined. Fear was still in their eyes. But behind that fear, something else was growing. Anger. The kind of anger that only comes when you've been pushed too far for too long. The night before the hearing, I barely slept, not from fear, but from fire. Because I knew tomorrow, we wouldn't just defend, we would strike. The community center was packed, more faces than before, some curious, some hostile, but many, waiting for something they hadn't seen in years. Hope. Caldwell sat at the head of the board, her hair perfect, her papers stacked high, her smile sharper than ever. She thought today would be my end. She thought today she would erase me. The gavel struck, the room quieted. "Mr. Daniels," she began, "this is your final hearing." But before she could continue, I stood, and behind me, others stood too. The single mother, the veteran, the family with the fence, the old man with his quiet nod, one by one. They filled the aisle, voices united in silence, presence louder than any words. I laid the papers on the table in front of Caldwell. Every fine, every false rule, every broken bylaw. Her smile faltered. Just slightly, but it was enough. "These," I said, my voice steady, "are your lies. These are the rules you twisted, the votes you rigged, the power you stole." Whispers spread across the room, neighbors leaning closer, eyes wide. I held up the page with the clause about trespassing. I read it aloud for all to hear, and when I finished, I turned to the crowd. They trespassed on my land without permission, and they called me the criminal. Gasps echoed against the walls. Even those who doubted me shifted uneasily in their chairs. Caldwell slammed her hand on the table. "This hearing is not about—" But the old man cut her off, his voice strong despite the years. "This hearing is about truth, and the truth is, you've been breaking your own rules for decades." The room erupted, neighbors shouting, voices rising like a storm breaking through the dam. Caldwell's smile collapsed into a sneer. Her eyes darted to her board members, but they looked pale, shaken. One even closed his folder, too afraid to meet my eyes. For the first time, the queen had no throne. I leaned forward, my voice low but sharp enough to cut the silence. "You tried to take everything from me, but now, everyone sees who you really are." Caldwell's lips trembled, her hands gripped the edge of the table, but no words came out. The crowd wasn't with her anymore. The next morning, I called the HOA office. I asked to speak with Caldwell. The secretary on the line hesitated, then told me she was unavailable, unreachable, untouchable. But I knew better. Caldwell wasn't hiding. She was watching. She was waiting for me to crack. And maybe I did. Because that night, I dreamed of fire, of the community center burning, of the board's neat little papers curling to ash. I woke with sweat on my neck and anger in my chest for the first time. I wondered if peace was even possible anymore. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps on the door just after dusk. I opened it to find 2 men in suits, Not neighbors, not contractors, lawyers. They introduced themselves as representatives of the association and handed me a folder thick with papers. Inside, pages of accusations, threats of liens, of foreclosure, of forced seizure. Failure to comply, one of them said, will result in loss of property. Loss of property. Those words rang in my ears like a church bell of doom. I stood there in the doorway, folder heavy in my hands. The men turned and left without another word. Their black car rolled off into the night, and I was left alone with the sound of my own heartbeat. I sat on the porch under the dim light, flipping through the pages, every line more poisonous than the last, every signature a dagger aimed at my home. They weren't just trying to break me, they were trying to erase me. I stared out at the street, the houses lined in perfect rows, the lawns trimmed like carpets, the streetlights glowing pale against the night sky. And I thought, maybe they would be happier if I was gone. Maybe Caldwell would smile wider if she could erase the memory of me altogether. But then I looked down at my hands, rough hands, hands that had built fences, fixed roofs, tilled soil, hands that had held this land together since the day I inherited it from my father, and I knew I could never let go. Not now, not ever. The days that followed turned darker. One evening I came home to find police waiting in my drive, neighbors gathered on the sidewalk, whispering, pointing. The officer approached me slow. "Sir, we've received reports that you've threatened board members with violence." My jaw tightened. I shook my head. No threats, no violence. Lies. But he wasn't there to argue, he was there to warn. One more incident, he said, and they'd have no choice but to press charges. The crowd behind him shifted, eyes wide, phones raised, recording me like I was some criminal on display. I stood tall, arms crossed, and I said nothing, because nothing I said would change what they had already decided. The officer left, the neighbors scattered, and I was left standing in the glow of my porch light. Alone, but not defeated that night. I made a choice. I would not wait for them to strike again. I would not sit in silence while they carved lies into my name. If they wanted war, I would give it to them. I gathered every letter, every note, every warning. I spread them across the table like pieces of a puzzle, and in those papers, I saw their weakness, in their arrogance. They had made mistakes, contradictions, errors, rules, twisted too far even for their own bylaws, and I would use it all. The board thought they had me cornered, but what they didn't know was that I wasn't fighting alone anymore because the old man who nodded at me outside the hearing? He came by the next morning, a quiet knock at my back door, and with him, he brought stories. Stories of how the board had lied before, how they had crushed other families, how they had bent rules to suit themselves. His words lit a fire inside me, and I realized this wasn't just my fight. It was bigger, much bigger. I wasn't just standing for my land. I was standing for everyone they had silenced. And suddenly, the fear turned to purpose. I knew what had to be done, and I knew the storm was coming, because snakes don't die easy. But when they do, they thrash the hardest. The power had shifted, the fear was broken. By the end of that night, the vote never happened. The hearing collapsed into chaos, and the board scattered like roaches when the lights come on. I walked out into the night with the old man at my side. The others followed. Neighbors who had once turned their backs now nodded with respect. Some even shook my hand. The air felt different, lighter, cleaner, as if the neighborhood had finally exhaled after years of holding its breath. But I knew the war wasn't finished. Caldwell would lick her wounds. She would scheme in the shadows. Snakes don't die easy. Yet for the first time, I wasn't alone. For the first time, it wasn't just me against them, it was us. And in that unity, I found strength, stronger than any rifle, stronger than any paper. Weeks passed, the board went quiet. No fines, no notes, no surveyors creeping onto my land. Silence returned to the neighborhood. But this time, it wasn't judgment, it was peace. I fixed my fence, I mowed my yard, I sat on the porch in the evening sun and let the cicadas sing, and for the first time in years, it felt like home again. Still, I keep the rifle close. Not because I expect trouble, but because trouble has a way of finding men who refuse to bow. And if it comes again, I'll be ready. So I'll ask you this. If the HOA came after your land, your name, your very life in the neighborhood, Would you fight alone until the end, or would you stand up and lead others to fight beside you?